My name's Peter Sutton. I'm the editor for the BFS Horizons, British Fantasy Society fiction magazine. But we're definitely not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about Alastair Reynolds, and I almost think that it's not worth doing an introduction because everybody will know. But I'm just going to read the first paragraph from the programme in case you've not read it already. Alastair Reynolds was born in Barry, South Wales. That's South Wales, not New South Wales.
As in Gavilan Station.
Yeah, in 1966. He studied at Newcastle and St Andrews Universities and has a PhD in astronomy. So it's Dr. Reynolds.
It is.
Indeed. He stopped working as an astrophysicist for the European Space Agency to become a full-time writer. Revelation Space in the year 2000 and Pushing Ice in 2005 was shortlisted for the Arthur C. Clarke Award. Revelation Space Absolution Gap 2003, Diamond Dogs 2001 and Century Reign 2004 were shortlisted for the British Science Fiction Award, and Chasm City 2001 won the British Science Fiction Award. The novella Slow Bullets won the Lucas Award. Okay,
Right.
that sounds good. So, start you with a fairly easy question. If somebody has yet to be an Alastair Reynolds fan, where should they start?
Well, I've written 20 or 21 novels. Depends if I count the Doctor Who one, and then there's the one I half wrote with Stephen Baxter. So it's sort of 20 or 21, and a lot of them are kind of interconnected. You know, they're sort of like in the future history, or they're part one of a trilogy or something like that. And I always prefer to steer people to the standalones because it's not such an investment of their time. You know, that if they don't like it, they've only wasted a few weeks of their life or something like that. So the ones I point people to are possibly House of Suns, which I wrote in 2008, which is it's a total standalone. It's very far future, so that's maybe some people are into that, some people aren't. But personally, I quite like it. I think it's one of my personal favourites.
Not the last book then, because that's standalone.
Well, but that's the sort of. I mean, yeah, you always like your last book a lot, don't you? The last one is also a standalone, but yeah, I mean, I think historically, it's always, I've tended to say, try House of Suns, maybe try Pushing Ice, which is another science fiction book with a, you know, it stands on its own. I try and sound people out for what do you like? You know, if people say, oh, I like detective fiction, then I say, well, maybe try Century Reign, which is also a standalone book, but it's got a sort of a noir 1950s detective vibe about it as well, which might appeal to some people. Yeah. You kind of you've got to sort of sound people out a little bit to find out what their thing is, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, because science fiction is such a huge canvas.
It is. We'll come on to that, I think. Yeah. So once somebody is a fan and they're like, right, I need to mainline, what order should they read the Revelation Space novels? Well, because there are, believe it or not, websites or at least web pages dedicated to this.
Yeah, you could. I mean, I always think it's like you can read them in like internal chronological order, which I don't really recommend, or you can read in the order I wrote them, which is kind of probably the best. But then you have to kind of get. You know, I talk about it slightly flippantly as the pain barrier of the first novel. You know, you kind of have to get over the hump of I like to think I was learning my craft with my first few books. And I'm still on a journey of learning my craft as well now. But I think the later books are an easier read than the first few. You know, so you kind of have to sort of process that somehow. Okay. But I would say just start reading them in the order they were published, because that's the order I wrote them. And I did. Even though the books have got connective tissue between them, I've always tried to write them that you can just pick that one up and read it cold, and you're not going to have a horrible reading experience.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned learning your craft, so let's talk about the start. So selling stories to Interzone in the late 80s, early 90s,
yes.
And then it was like a decade before.
Yeah, it was.
The book came out,
it didn't.
So.
Yeah, it was. I'm not sure how that happened, but I started, made my mind up that I wanted to be a writer, an actual published writer around about 1981, 1982, and I was writing short stories for myself in longhand, and I became aware that there were writers I was enjoying who had sort of anthologies of short stories, but then I became vaguely aware that there were sort of magazines that they might have published in, and that might be the route to actually getting these things published. I learned of things like analog science fiction and a magazine of fantasy and science fiction. I had no clue how to get hold of them. I mean, I was living in Barry, Bridgend, no internet, no, hundreds of miles from even Forbidden Planet. I didn't have a clue how you would go about getting hold of an American science fiction magazine. And then in the mid-80s, our local library in Pencoed, which is a little village near Bridgend, they had the Interzone anthology. So Interzone had been going for a year or two at that point, and then they put out a paperback anthology of the best stories from Interzone up to that point. I took it out of the library and I read it and I hated it because it was all sort of very new wave, no spaceships, no robots. It was all sort of like near future dystopian stuff. Very little bit sort of pushed my buttons, so I gave it back to the library. But a few weeks later, for some reason, I thought I'll give it another go. I took it out again, and I kind of got on with a few of the stories a bit better the second time. And then at the back of the book was a sort of tear out coupon for write to Interzone and take out a subscription. So I did, got my mum to write me a check for 4 issues. It was only quarterly at the time, and I got my first issue of Interzone. It was like Interzone 11 or something like that. With this sort of, I still remember it. It's like a red cover with the J.G. Ballard story on the front, and that was it. Then I thought, okay, if this is the only magazine I can access, then I will direct all my energies into breaking into Interzone, which took 5 years even then. But it was also I wasn't ready to sell the story, but also the magazine had to evolve a bit, and I think it over the next 2 or 3 years, they had the first short story by Stephen Baxter. So that was a kind of shift in intent of the magazine. They were sort of saying, they might be going a little bit more towards hard science fiction and spaceships. And then Paul Macaulay appeared in it, and then Ian Watson, who'd written a few stories already for Interzone, he did one that was set on a spaceship. So there was a sort of slight shift in their emphasis, which I felt, okay, this is kind of moving in a direction I can work with, because I want to write spaceship and robot stories as well. And I sent them some. I was a student at the time, and I had a manual typewriter, but I couldn't use it in my student room because it was too noisy. So I'd spend all term thinking about a short story, and then when I went home for Easter holidays or whatever, I'd write a story with the carbon paper and all that, and then I would send that to Interzone. You wouldn't hear anything for about 2 or 3 months, then you get the rejection letter, which would probably land about the time I was back home. Yeah. And I just did that for 5 years, and I sent them, maybe 1 or 2 stories a year, nothing very good. And then one time I sent them a story, and I'd actually had a bit of an epiphany, which is that I thought, what I've sent them so far, it's kind of like, I was trying to write cyberpunk, I was trying to imitate William Gibson, and I didn't know anything. I was like sort of 19, I didn't have a clue about the world. I thought, rather than trying to imitate what everybody else is doing, why don't I try and write a story that they won't have seen before? It was kind of like an obvious idea in retrospect. Yeah. And so I thought, I'll just go to my library and I'll just find some topic that I've not seen a science fiction story on. So I went to the university library, and there was like a shelf on like anthropology, and there was like about 20 books on Eskimo culture. I thought, I bet you they haven't had a science fiction story about Eskimo or Inuit or Inupiat culture. So I took these books off and I wrote a story featuring Inupiat culture. It was also a science fiction story, and I sent it to them. And I kind of had a feeling, I thought, whatever they make of it, they won't have seen anything quite like that before. And they wrote back and said, we're not going to publish it, but we think it, maybe consider.
So is it a good?
It was like, they said you might want to rewrite it, maybe send it to us again. So I did that. I sent them a second go of it a few months later, and I got like the most disappointing acceptance letter, and it was sort of like, okay, we'll take a chance on this, It was like, and it was like, okay, I've been waiting for this moment for years, and it was really sort of like a gut punch, but there was still a check, so it was like a check for £230, which was more than I ever had in my possession at any one time, you know, so
Yeah.
it was a big deal. And then I
so
quickly sold them a second story, so I sort of felt I'm on a roll here, so that was good, yeah. And that was a sort of long...
it's always nice to be paid for a story.
It's very nice, yeah. It was the start of a long association with Interzone that kind of carried on for literally decades. Yeah.
So, I mean, you mentioned that you've started the writing as a student. So was it that you were interested in science and the science fiction came after, or were you interested in the science fiction and thought the way to get into that was to learn science?
It goes so far back into my childhood. I can't disentangle the one from the other. Always been obsessed with space and the future, right from, you know, since I was tiny. And I think I was interested in science as a career because of things like Carl Sagan, Cosmos. That's
my very next question.
Right. Okay. Well, that aired on television at around, you know, that I would have been 13 or 14 when that aired. You know, it's just that point in your life where you can begin to start making sort of choices about the direction you might want to take your life in. You know, what O levels you're going to pick, and you know what A levels you're going to choose. So that was important. But yeah, whether the science came before the science fiction or the science fiction after the science, I really don't know. And it's never really bothered me. I mean, now I'm, you know, I was a scientist writing science fiction. Now I'm a science fiction writer, but I still get to have a toe in the science world because of the science fiction, which is something that I find quite enjoyable.
Yeah. So you mentioned Carl Sagan. I was like, so there's going to be scientists that you've been inspired by, but all the writers that you've been inspired by. Carl Sagan, quite famously, was both, and he was a very good writer as well as a very good scientist. But who was it that inspired you in that period?
Well, the first sort of science fiction writer I clicked with, you know, prior to that, my exposure to science fiction had been Doctor Who and Star Trek, and you know, Joe 90 and things like that. And then when I was probably about 8, I started getting a magazine. Didn't have it was a magazine aimed squarely at boys. Didn't have a very long lifespan. It was full of stuff like cutaway drawings of battleships and Spitfires and things like that. But at the end of each issue, they had a reprint of an Arthur C. Clarke short story, and nicely illustrated. And that was where I started reading. I read sort of the classic 1940s and 50s Clarke short stories about sort of bolting together space stations, and never really looked back. I mean, I went straight from that to reading his novels, and I read 2001 probably when I was about 12. You know, didn't understand a word of it, but I was quite happy to.
I read it fairly recently.
Yeah,
Still didn't
yeah,
understand
yeah.
a word of it.
But I was happy to throw myself into what you might call adult science fiction at an early age, and they did a ton of Clarke short stories in this serialization, and then when they ran up Clarke, they started doing the robot stories of Asimov. So again, I read them pretty much. I just thought they were just like concurrent. You know, I didn't realise they were old stories. They were just exciting to read.
It was there.
So it was like Clarke. I mean, it was all the sort of obvious big names. You know, Clarke, Asimov, Philip K. Dick, a bit of James White. You know, a little bit of Heinlein later. And I didn't read. You know, there's like the sort of there's that sort of nuts and bolts core science fiction, and then there's more sort of literary stuff that's kind of aged better. Where, you know, we would talk about sort of J.G. Ballard or M. John Harrison or Ursula Le Guin, the stuff that kind of still has some literary respectability now. I didn't really read that stuff till later. You know, it was like my early science fiction reading was the obvious big names, plus sort of like Roald Dahl as well, who I think sort of occupied something of the same niche in my imagination. You know, like Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. They go to a space station.
Yeah, I think for me it's like Lloyd Bickle Jr. and E. Dr. Smith. I was reading that around about that same time. Yeah, interesting. So the other thing that I was going to ask about Carl Sagan is that he was a planetary scientist.
Yes.
And you were an astronomer. So and astronomy and planets are a fairly new thing. So were you more interested in the sort of the stars, or was the planetary part part of what you?
I just wanted,
what brought you to it?
I wanted to be an astronomer. I mean, the long story is that I wanted to be an astronaut, and when I was doing my degree, they had a careers advisory day, and you went and filled in forms, and I think some of it was even on a computer, and it was really amazing. It was on a computer. Wow. But what I really wanted to be was a pilot, because I thought pilot then astronaut. You know, that was my career trajectory that I had. But they sort of said, well, I wasn't wearing glasses at the time, but they said, do you have any medical things? I said, yeah, I've got asthma. Oh, well, that's it. Forget it. You know.
Wrote you off straight away.
Yeah. And I was really sort of thrown by that. But then I thought, well, hang on. It's sort of like the year 2000 was still a long way in the future. And I thought, well, by then we'll have, like, if you go into space science, you'll be able to work in space, because we'll have sort of telescopes on the moon and things like that. You know, I was thinking it'd be like the British Antarctic Survey, that there'd be a sort of human presence on the moon.
Yeah.
And that if you get into space science now in the sort of mid-80s, by the time the year 2000 rolls around, it won't be all that unusual to go into space as a scientist. So I thought, yeah, I'll still do it. I'll still be able to get into space. Obviously that didn't happen, but that was part of my driver for choosing space science. My particular interest was, I really was interested in particle physics, and I was very interested in cosmology, and those are the areas I wanted to possibly go into for further research. But they're very, those are the areas everyone wants to go into, and you have to be really hot at maths and stuff, which I wasn't particularly.
I wasn't.
Yeah.
But
so
I would have loved to have gone into it, but I wasn't.
So I couldn't get a placement. I wanted to go to Cambridge to study cosmology, and they wouldn't have me.
Yeah.
Edinburgh wouldn't have me. Durham said, well, we can't have you this year, but if you sort of doss around for a year, we might be able to find some money next. But out of that period, I was offered a position to study stellar astronomy.
Right.
And I thought, well, it's not quite what I had in mind, but it's still astronomy, so I'm not going to turn my nose up at that.
Yeah.
So that's where that happened.
Okay. So space is quite big. I think over the period of your career, your writing career, I think that your attitude to the Fermi paradox has changed. Do you agree? And if it has, why?
Well, I mean, perhaps we should just go over the Fermi paradox, because I think it's not you know, if you talk about science fiction a lot, it's part of the sort of language of science fiction, isn't it? But well, the Fermi paradox was this argument articulated by Enrico Fermi in the 1940s, and he was one of the. If you've seen, those of you who've seen Oppenheimer, the big film, he's the Italian physicist in Oppenheimer. So he was a big part of the Manhattan Project, but he also had a side interest in the universe and life, and his sort of bone of contention was that if there's life out there in the universe, shouldn't it have come to us already? Because the universe is a big place, but it's not all that big, and you don't have to travel at the speed of light to get across the galaxy in a fairly short time compared to, say, the age of the universe. So his sort of point was, it's kind of weird that we haven't seen anybody yet. What does that tell us about life in the universe? Does it mean that they're out there but they don't want to come here, or they're here already but we don't see them? And just grappling with that as a conundrum is the Fermi paradox. And I think science fiction's a good tool to think about the Fermi paradox. And particularly if you think about, when I first started writing science fiction, I was very much writing it in the mode of Star Wars and Star Trek. And you think about classic Star Trek, I really love Star Trek, but you have like
warp speed.
The Federation goes out into space, and then they meet the Romulans and the Klingons, and all the other sort of alien cultures. And certainly in the early series, they all had about the same technological level, so they'd all had sort of spaceships that could attack each other, but it wasn't like an overwhelming technological disparity between the Klingons and Captain Kirk, or with the Romulans. So that kind of implies that they've emerged on about the same time scale. and you think, well, that's highly unlikely, given that the universe is 13 billion years old, the Milky Way is maybe 4 or 5 billion years old. What are the likelihood that all these galactic civilizations just pop up at the right time that they can have space battles? It's probably not going to happen like that. And I sort of a lot of the science fiction I was writing it as a youngster kind of took that unexamined assumption that we'll go out there and we'll meet other aliens, but they'll have spaceships, and we can sort of interact with them on a sort of more or less on a parity. It's highly unlikely. So once I started, I suppose, thinking a bit more seriously, I tried to think around that issue and build it into my fiction. I don't have a sort of set opinion on the Fermi paradox. I think it's just a useful way of generating ideas within a story framework.
Yeah. So you mentioned Star Trek there.
Yeah.
So a lot of your fiction, the science is more realistic than non-realistic, and there's faster than light and non-faster than light travel. Do you find it a good constraint to keep the science real, or is it only real until it breaks the story?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's again going back to I wrote 2 novels in my teens, which I've never tried to sell, and they were very much in the sort of mould of. The first one was very much inspired by Star Wars, and then I sort of read a bit more science fiction, and there was probably a bit of James White in there and a bit of Larry Niven, but it's got hyperdrives and things like that. By the time I was starting to write a 3rd novel, I was a little bit dissatisfied with this because I started reading some of the more grown-up science fiction writers, who didn't have faster than light traveling. I thought that's what I should be doing, and I made a real effort to keep it within that constraint for Revelation space, and not out of masochism. More that I thought, well, it's going to make it just a bit different than the other space operas that they're seeing, and that might help. And also, I think whenever you put a constraint into fiction, it opens up as many story ideas as it shuts down. I always say it's like the great thing about Star Wars is that Han Solo can get in the Millennium Falcon and he can be at another planet by lunchtime. So, which works really well if you're trying to tell a story in which you've got like a teeming, massively populated, intricate galaxy with billions of planets and different cultures, and you want to be able to tell a rapidly moving story. But if you want to convey, say, the immense emptiness of space and the fact that things are very far apart and timescales are enormous and scary, that works against it. It negates that sort of that tendency. So you'd want a different approach if you were trying to sort of get the cosmic horror and the awe of the immensity of the universe across.
Indeed.
More of a Kubrick sort of feeling. But it doesn't mean that I'm, I don't deprecate that type of science fiction. I'm perfectly capable of enjoying it on its own terms.
Yeah. So going back a step to what you said at the beginning, you've got 20 odd novels, numerous stories, novellas, etc. And you've said that Revelation Space is more of a mosaic than the series now, and you've got a number of standalone novels. Like I said, the last one was standalone. How do you pick and choose between the projects as to what you're going to do next?
I tend to. I don't have a grand plan. I never have. I've always never really had a clue what I'm going to be doing more than one book ahead, and it tends to be when I'm about 2/3 of the way through whatever I'm working on at the moment, I start getting a sense of what I might want to work on after that. It's like an itch, or it might be a contrast. If I've worked on a particular canvas, I feel like I've had enough of that for a while. I'd like to do something different for the next book. But there's no great sort of strategic thinking behind it. Right. The only thing I would say is that having written the connected novels of the Revelation Space Universe, and then there's 2 other trilogies. There's the Blue Remembered Earth trilogy, and then there's the Ness Sisters trilogy, neither of which I really meant to go in, you know, they sort of emerge as trilogies. I kind of had enough of that. I don't think I'm particularly good at getting those over the line. If you know, I'm better at things that are function on their own terms, and you know, that are not sequels and prequels and things like that. So I'd like to do a bit more of that going forward. So I think certainly, as far as I'm concerned, the next sort of 3 novels will all be unrelated to anything else and unrelated to each other.
Right. Did the deal that you got, so the £1 million deal,
yeah.
Did that change the way that you approach things at all?
Well, it was the deal was, there were a lot of motivations, a lot of motivational factors behind that deal. There was a period of uncertainty involving me and my relationship to my publisher, and the deal was part of the reason for the deal was to get things sort of lock in a sort of 10-year stability, whereas I didn't have to worry about the future. But that rapidly, the wheels came off that really quickly. I mean, by the end of the deal, I was on my 3rd editor. So I went. I mean, I can say that the 3 books of the Kinnear sequence, each of those was effectively written with a different editor. And every time there was a new editor, I think it was like a 12 to 18 month reset. So the whole thing ended up taking a lot longer than 10 years. So that certainly didn't work out as planned. But it did give me I wasn't worried, or I wasn't sort of sitting worrying about where's my next book contract going to come from. I could at least have the freedom to just think about writing.
Okay. So as part of your process, do you take walks? So you say that you're a keen runner. Is that still the case, or?
What do you mean? Is it still the case? Isn't it obvious? Yeah, I'm very.
I was more thinking of COVID, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I'm still I'm a keen runner, but I don't get. I find running. I find it a bit of a struggle. I always have. I've been running for 35 years. It doesn't leave enough excess brain capacity for me to think up anything useful. But walking does. Yeah. Walking's a good one. Yeah. And I've always had this philosophy that a lot of writing involves forcing your way through the hard bits. That you've got to sort of put the hard yards in and not give up, not stop working on a particular project, keep going. But there's a point where I always think if you've been bashing your head against a screen for 3 days and you haven't written a word, it's take a day off. Yeah. Go for a walk, go to the pictures. It's that giving yourself permission to just walk away from it. And it often releases that block.
I mean, do you suffer from writing block at all?
I think everybody probably has a different definition of block, don't they? I get creatively stuck because of plot decisions, or I might go down a wrong direction with the story, and you kind of not quite sure if you're going in the right direction, and then you realise you're not. But it's very hard to tell. I mean, there was I think it was a remark by Stephen King, and he said something like, just because the writing's difficult doesn't mean you're not doing worthwhile work. So sometimes it feels bloody awful, and it's like chipping through granite, and you feel like you're not making much progress each day. But that actually might turn out to be really good stuff. Yeah. And on the other hand, the stuff that feels effortless might not actually be of great particular value. So it's very hard to calibrate.
It's very difficult afterwards to look at something and go, oh, that bit, I was having lots of problems, and that bit I wasn't. And it doesn't read that way.
No. Well, I tend to, I work on the rough assumption that if it's too easy, I'm not challenging myself. I've got to make it difficult for myself on some level, which means it's not always fun. I mean, like writing for me began as a hobby, and it was a hobby that I monetized, and then it became a day job. Yeah. And any transaction where you introduce sort of deadlines and contracts, it sort of moves out of the arena of pure fun into something else, which doesn't mean it can still be enjoyable, but it comes with a whole, a lot of additional baggage that you don't get from something that's pure pleasure, pure play. So there are days where it's not fun, and it's a slog, but I force myself through that, and then the reward for that is when it goes well, or you have a, quite late in the writing of novels, I always find that your subconscious starts picking up on connections that were maybe implicit, but you didn't realise it, and you start thinking, oh wow, maybe I could do that, and wow, oh cool. Those are the bits where you get the payback. That's where the fun comes back in.
But are you one of those people that would say, when somebody asks you, do you enjoy writing, you say, I enjoy having written?
Yeah, well, I certainly enjoy the subsequent drafts. I love revising, tightening.
Right.
So I love working with a draft that I've worked. The first draft is a bit of a slog, but I really enjoy taking that and making something better from it.
Yeah.
And I hate. I like that bit. I hate all the stuff that comes after. I hate editing. I hate proofreading. There's a point in that cycle where my self-confidence, my self-worth in my identity as a writer hits absolute rock bottom.
Right.
I think I'm a worthless, useless excuse for a writer, and I should never be allowed near a keyboard again. And then it sort of it kind of goes back up again till that same point the following year.
For me, it's when it's come out and then you have to go around and tell people about it. And say, I don't want to do that.
By the time the books come out, I tend to be emotionally invested in the next one.
The next one. Yeah.
So have we got to talk about that bloody thing now? The thing I wrote last year.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay. So again, on the what you work on next. There's a bunch of books that you said will never get a sequel, and there's a bunch of books you say you would like to work on more in that universe. So again, how do you choose, or how have you made the decision that something's never going to get a sequel, for example?
Well, it's off. I have said in the past that I'd like to do a sequel to Book X and Book Y, and I was sincere at the time. But then, you just sometimes you wake up and you think, well, it's been 10 years now. Is there really that big a demand for it? And other factors, like if I did a book with a particular editor and now I'm working with another editor, they've got no emotional, buy into that earlier book. Why should I? Yeah. So maybe it's better to just move on to pastures new. And I think also there's a thing where, and I'm a reader and I'm a fan as well, and I know the feeling where you really want someone to do something, but when they do it, it will never quite live up to your expectations of what it could have been. We all thought, sorry if I'm going to offend people here, but we all thought Star Wars prequels were going to be fantastic, didn't we? Wow, he's going to make more Star Wars films, it's going to be the best thing ever. Wow. Oh. Yeah. And then oh no, well they're going to make some sequels now, so they'll be really good as well. And it's that thing where
returns.
The shining citadel of your imagination never quite matched by the reality.
Yeah. So I mean, that will bring us on to a nice other question. Mentioning that you're a fan, and you mentioned it earlier. So Doctor Who, how did that come about? Writing for the Doctor.
Well, I've loved Doctor Who since I was a kid. The usual cliches of hiding behind the city and all that, really everything to a T. Yeah. John Pertwee era Doctor Who, and then Tom Baker. Grew out of it a little bit later with the later Doctors, but then I've always had that affection for it, and then I kind of was really glad when it came back on television. And I had absolutely one of the best days of my life. I was in Florida at personal invitation to see a space shuttle launch.
Oh wow!
So in the morning I'm in the hotel and we were thinking about driving to Cape Kennedy, and I get an email. Would you like to write a Doctor Who novel? So, this stage is not going to get any better. So it was
So did that come really out of the blue? Or?
Yeah, because
surely you mentioned it.
No, I hadn't. And there was a remark. Ian Banks, I believe it was Ian Banks, and it went something like this. Someone said to him, "I've seen you on Mastermind. I've seen you on University Challenge. How do you get those gigs?" And he said something like, "You cannot ask for it. You can't legislate for it. You can't beg for it. You just have to let these things happen." And I've always believed in that. Just let the universe bring the good things in its own time, or not. And I made a point of never ever saying I'd love to do a Doctor Who novel. So that just came out of the blue, and I was really happy with it.
How did you approach it? Did you approach it in a very different way to the other novels, or
Well, there was some.
was there a Bible that you had to
No,
adhere to at all?
there were. It's quite funny because I had some initial conversations over the phone with the gentleman I was working with at BBC Books, and he sort of established some early ground rules, and it's like, well, he said, well, you're writing it for an adult audience, but we have to work on the assumption it will be read by younger readers. So there's no profanity, and the depiction of violence was very was very clearly specified what would and would not be allowed.
Yeah.
So you could have someone being exterminated, but you couldn't have someone point a firearm at someone else.
Right.
Because I think they were concerned about people picking up guns and things like that. I wasn't concerned about the profanity because I thought, well, that wouldn't work within. There was never profanity in Doctor Who anyway.
Yeah.
So if I'm going to try and emulate the feel of classic Doctor Who, I wouldn't be having people swearing and things. So that was okay, and I went off and I wrote the book. They did say you.
Did you immediately have an idea for the book? Or
I had an idea.
Did you have a big list of ideas?
I came up with a list of ideas, and the one I know I've mentioned this before, but this is going back to a time in Doctor Who before they had brought the Sontarans back. So I always loved the Sontarans. They hadn't been on television for about 30 years at that point. And I had an idea for a Sontaran story set in Napoleonic times.
Right.
And I said, can I use the Sontarans? They said, yeah, you can because there's no, you can't have the Cybermen, you can't have the Daleks because there are rights issues with the different estates. So they said you can mention the Daleks, but you can't have them on the page. The Sontarans are okay. And I said, oh, can I have the Master as well? Can I have Joe Grant? Yeah. But particularly the Sontarans. But then I thought, well, hang on, this might be my only shot at ever writing anything in the Doctor Who continuum,
Yeah.
So maybe I'd be better off coming up with my own monsters. So then I backed off from that and I tried to come up with a different story that had just monsters of my own devising in.
Right.
But it was an awfully long period. It was almost a year, I think, of just talking about it because they weren't in any rush to have the book.
Okay.
Yeah, they wanted to bring out a bunch of Doctor Who novelizations in 2013, and this was like 2010 when we were having the initial discussion. So there was no great rush.
No great rush.
It was all just to take your time, and when
It's
you've got some ideas.
It's probably quite different now.
Probably, yeah.
Since it's come back. Yeah.
But just going back to the bit about the gun.
Yeah.
So I got to a point in the book where I had to have a character persuade another character to leave a room, and I thought, well, I can't think of how she's going to get him out of the room now. So I'll have her point a gun at him, or him point a gun at her, whatever. And I'll think of something better because they won't let me have the scene with the gun. They've told me that, but they didn't pick up on it. so it's in the book. Yeah.
You did that bracket of something better.
Yeah, I thought I'll just put it in as a placeholder and I'll figure something out later.
Yeah. So talking TV still, Live, Death and Robots. How did that come about? The adaptations.
Well, that was another one of those emails out of the blue from my film agent. So I have a book agent and a TV film agent,
sure.
like that, and she'd had an approach from Tim Miller, who was had just done Deadpool, and he was interested in resurrecting Heavy Metal, the sort of animated series or film, whatever that had been, and they were buying up. I was told they bought about 30 short stories. And they were looking to acquire the rights to about 30 short stories to make some kind of animated thing. It wasn't necessarily going to be a series. It might have been a film, with episodic film or something like that. And they were interested in 2 of my stories. They were going to buy the rights to 3 because there was an overlapping character, so they wanted to sort of have that story, but they weren't going to make it. Yeah. And again, it was the rights. As it happened, those were 2 stories I wasn't. Had they come and asked about some other stories, I would have been much more protective of the rights and much less willing to give them away, because you kind of give your life away
Yeah.
to Netflix
You don't,
with it.
you don't have much control once it's.
No,
once
and
it's
also
gone,
they
I
had the
suppose.
freedom to go away and do their own, take the characters and do their own sort of thing with them. And I wouldn't have done that with some of the stuff, but with the particular stories with Zima Blue and Beyond the Aquila Rift, and I thought, well, I'm okay with whatever they do with them, and it might be a useful way of getting my name out there a little bit. So I'm quite happy to do this as an experiment and see what comes of it. And it was
what do you think of them
well,
once it came out?
it took a long time. My personal preference, I'm slightly more a fan of Zima Blue as a story in its own right of of my stories. I think it's more personal, and also that the way they did that story was more of a traditional animation style, which I really liked. Whereas the other one was more sort of motion capture, CGI, which it tends to leave me a bit cold. I'm not into.
Yeah.
I don't quite get that. I'm not interested in that photorealistic sort of direction that they go down.
Yeah.
And the other thing was the animation team that did Zima Blue. They'd done a video for Metallica,
Right.
so obviously that was the one I was going to go for.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I like them both, yeah. But I think Zima Blue is short, it's closer to the spirit of the original story. The Beyond the Aquila Rift is it's a quite long short story. They distilled it down to about 7 minutes. Put a massive sex scene in the middle, which is sort of like, it's like 2 lines in the story, so there were sort of aspects of it that sort of sat a little bit uncomfortably with me. I thought, why have they done that? You didn't need that. It's not what the story's about.
It needs to do something to do with love and love after breakups, I suppose.
Yeah. But I was happy with it.
Yeah.
I had no sort of creative input. I mean, maybe I could have. I think Tim Miller is quite a nice guy. I think he's quite open to communication. I've had a lot of exchanges with him since that.
Right.
About this and that. So he's very chatty and open-minded. I don't think he's. I'm sure if I had stuck my oar in, he would have probably been quite receptive. But I just let them get on with it.
So I mean that sort of opens the question of, if you did have creative control, is there something of yours that you'd really like to see adapted that hasn't been?
There's a lot of stuff that it would be in an ideal world. I would like to have seen. The Revenger books, the Nest Sisters. I think that would have made a good animation, or a good. Did you see do you know the films of City of Lost Children? Delicatessen,
Yes.
Jew and Caro. Yeah, I really like their aesthetic. I met one of them.
Oh, yeah?
I said I'm a big fan. Something like that I think could have worked well.
Yeah.
But you just have to. I don't go chasing those opportunities, and I always think at the end of the day, the thing that's fired me up about science fiction was prose science fiction. Like, I wanted to be a writer,
Yes.
and if I'd wanted to get into movie making, I would have gone into movie making. So I kind of like
script writing.
Yeah, I just try to anything else that happens is a bonus. But I don't try I try not to get too distracted by it. I just try and concentrate on what I'm writing at any given time. Anything else is nice if it happens, no big deal if it doesn't.
Cool. I'm aware that I should leave some time for questions by other people, but maybe I'll skip to a final question. Is there something? Is there a story or a book that you wish more people had read of yours that hasn't had the love that you think it deserves?
All of them. All of them. No, I think novels. The novels have all had a fair crack. I mean, there's some that have got their little devotees. Some of my books have been generally less popular than others, but there'll always be people who stand up for them, which I appreciate. One of my personal favourites is Century Rain, which is the one about jazz in the 50s. And not everyone likes it, because I guess not everyone's into sort of detective stories. But the people who do like it really like it.
Or jazz in the 50s.
I'm just grateful for that. And Turbulent World, again, it wasn't everyone's cup of tea, but I'm grateful for the people who liked it. It's what I think short stories. Then I've written. there's a few where you think, wow, I've written a really good story, and I can't wait to unleash this on the world, and it's just like, it doesn't even make a plop. It's just like dropping a stone down an empty well. That was it. No one, I mean, I wrote one, I think I did it for PS Publishing, and it was the most, it's the story of mine that's had the least impact on the world. And it's a story about, it's not like a mega brilliant short story, but it's still okay. And it was about two guys who are skateboarders, and they find that their skate park overnight has disappeared, and there's a shining skyscraper where it used to be, and no one else is freaked out about this. Like they're the only two who think, hang on, that shouldn't be. And it's a kind of M.R. James sort of thing with Lovecraftian cosmic horror thing about how come what is this skyscraper? What is it really doing? And I thought it was a good story, but I don't think I've ever seen even a single reader reaction to it. Not a review, not even 1 star. This is garbage. I mean, I would take that, but that's completely off the radar. Yeah. So that happens from time to time. But you just, I mean, Zima Blue, it didn't make that much of a splash when it came out, but then, 10 years later, someone said, can I make a movie of it or animation? So things can have their own life.
Yeah, they have a time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to open it up and see if anybody else has got any questions. I've still got plenty more if they don't. But has anybody got any questions? Yes.
Answer. What 3 non-fiction and fiction books would you say have influenced you the most?
Do you want to repeat the question? Or?
Yeah, well, it was 3 non-fiction books and 3 fiction books that have been in. I think the non-fiction, I probably would say Cosmos would be one of them. So the book that was written to accompany it, and I've still got my copy of it, and I still dip into it now and again. Yeah. Carl Sagan's Cosmos. It's a really good book. Dated in some respects now, but there's still loads of good stuff in it. It's very beautiful. And then a book that
I quite like his other one, the Demon Haunted World.
Yeah, I read that, and that's fantastic. It had a big influence on me when I was a student. Yeah, it's all about the brain. Is that the Dragons of Springtime?
Dragons,
yeah. But they're all good.
It was prophetic of the times that we went through in like sort of 2016 era of all the fake news, etc.
Yeah.
What people will believe and not believe.
Yeah. No, I think you can return to his writing. And then there was a book by Arthur C. Clarke, that it was called Profiles of the Future, and I read that probably when I was about 13 or 14. And it's like Clarke. Until that point, I'd only read his science fiction, and this was like non-fiction by Clarke. And each chapter, he's looking at like what are the limits of the possible. So it's like, can we go faster than light? Can we do anti-gravity? Can we talk to whales?
Oh, right.
It just looks at every futuristic possibility, and then he sort of tries to put constraints on whether we might do this or might not do it. It's got everything in it. It's got everything from like machine translation, artificial intelligence. Really interesting book, and probably enormously dated now. I think it was written in the 60s, and then the one I had was like a lightly updated paperback, so it was probably from the late 70s. But that really gave me a toolkit as a writer. That what Clarke said was, I could take that as gospel.
Yeah, there's a similar one by Charles Sheffield, Borderlands, which is basically these are the borderlands of science that we don't quite know yet, and obviously that's out of date now. But it was kind of, this is what science could be in the future. I think. Another science fiction.
So I'd probably struggle to come up with a third one. There will be a third one, but those are the 2 big sort of things that had big influence on me when I was sort of starting out thinking about writing. And then in terms of fiction, the 2 things that, I mean, one of the things that was a big influence on me, but I don't know how clearly that's come out in my writing, but it really influenced my worldview, was The Name of the Rose.
Oh.
So that was a big book. Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose. It was a big kind of popular book of the mid-80s, and then the film followed very shortly afterwards. and I saw the film and then read the book. And I love the density of it, the sense of medievalism, but also that sort of Enlightenment worldview that he tries to put into the book, where the detective is a kind of scientist proxy, and he's using the tools of rationality to unravel this mystery in the monastery. And I loved it, and I thought, oh, I'd really like to write a science fiction book that has the same density and texture as The Name of the Rose. And then another book that I started drifting away from science fiction when I was probably about 18. I started reading like Russian novelists and contemporary English literature, and thinking science fiction was a bit passé. It wasn't really doing it for me anymore. And then the thing that brought me back after I'd subscribed to Interzone was more or less exactly the same time that the cyberpunk boom happened. And I read a writer I'd never heard of was Bruce Sterling, and I read his second novel, which was The Artificial Kid, that came out in paperback, and I thought it was pretty good. And then his third novel, Schismatrix, came out in 1985, and it just blew my mind on so many levels. It became one of those texts that they talk about the anxiety of influence, like I had to just get it away from me because it was influencing my writing and my thinking about the future to such a degree. You can see it, the hallmarks of it are all the way through Revelation Space, and probably still in my writing today. It's a future history. It's about it's the future history of our solar system from about 200 years from now out to about 500 years from now. It's about different political factions in the solar system, and then they start experimenting with genetic engineering and artificial intelligence and cybernetics, and then they start trying to bioengineer the ecosystems in the solar system, and then some aliens arrive and it gets even weirder, and it just follows one character as his life evolves across 200 years. He gets more and more alien and weird, and it's a book that it just, every page it just hits you with more weirdness, and for me it was almost like everything I'd read before that had been in black and white, and someone had just found the colour switch. So that book really blew my mind. And I know a lot of other science fiction writers had the same reaction. So I think Charlie Strauss, Ken MacLeod, Paul Macaulay, we all read Schismatrix, and we all thought it was absolutely the bee's knees. Yeah. And then other than that, I'd probably fall back on, say, Gene Wolfe, The Book of the New Sun, which is kind of leans into fantasy. It sort of plays with different tropes. Yeah. So wonderful Gene Wolfe. Yeah.
We've probably got time for one really quick question.
Thanks, buddy. Cheers. I'll let the moderator.
I wondered what you were reading now.
Right now I'm reading. I just finished reading a really good book. Give me a second. I'll tell you what. After I finished reading the really good book, which I can't quite remember what it was, but I will remember in a minute, I picked up Paul and Kornbluth's Wolfsbane, which is a 1959. Frederick Pohl and C.M. Kornbluth wrote collaborative novels together in the 50s, and then Kornbluth died, unfortunately. He was only 35 when he died. But the most well-known of those books is The Space Merchants, which is a satire about advertising.
Right.
It's like Mad Men era Wall Street advertising turned up to the max and projected out into the solar system. It's very good. I mean, it was very good when I read it. But Wolfsbane is absolutely terrible. And I'm like, I've been waiting all my life to read this book. And I always thought the cover was so cool, but it's not aged well. But it's not. I mean, it's not. It doesn't reflect poorly on Pohl. Pohl's a great writer, and Kornbluth was a great writer. Just this was a bit of a dud. And the one I read before that was. It was the new book by Nick Harkaway.
Noir one.
Titanium Noir. Yeah.
That's really good.
Yeah, which is a brilliant book because it's about it's a sort of a contemporary detective story set in a world where all the rich people have had genetic engineering treatment, and every time they have an injection, they get 10% larger. And it's such a good metaphor for the
Yeah.
haves and have-nots.
I
Yeah.
saw Nick on the first leg of that tour, and yeah, he wasn't quite sure how to, because there was lots of questions obviously, and
Yeah.
he was like, I've been let out of my rating, to talk to people.
Yeah.
It was really good.
Yeah.
All that's left is to.
Well,
thank
it's
Alastair.
one of the books I read very recently.
Okay.
I think I'd like to just big it up. Was the new novel by Naomi Alderman. So she wrote The Power, and
Yes.
she's got a new one coming out. It must be coming out soon, like this month or next month, called The Future.
Right.
And it's about it's kind of about the world we live in now with Elon Musk, and there's stand-ins for the sort of the technocrats who run the world and run social media and run Amazon. What if they're worse than they are now? How do we deal with that? Yeah, and it's an optimistic response to that, a sort of roadmap to a better world. So I thought it was a really
That's
fantastic
interesting.
book. Yeah, really brilliant
And
book.
The Power was
Yeah,
really
yeah.
good.
It's an absolutely fantastic book. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Right. So please join me in thanking
Thank you.